Hey everyone. In the last video, we discussed about the history of derivatives and how it dates back to 17th century. In this video, we're going to talk about two specific types of derivatives, which are futures and forwards. So let's dive in. Futures is basically like a promise that a buyer gives to a seller and the seller gives to a buyer, saying at a given point of time, there will be a deal done at the agreed upon price and for the agreed upon quantity. That's all about it. So instead of verbally agreeing to a price and a quantity, we are just making sure that we're documenting the promise. That's about it. So you can just imagine it as like a written promise between a buyer and a seller. That's like a futures derivative at a very basic level, right? So now let's understand how the futures mechanics work with an example. So let's dive in. So imagine we have two players. We have the buyer and the seller. And let's say the underlying commodity is wheat and the current price of wheat is $5. Now, in this case, the buyer thinks that after 2 months, the price of the wheat might increase. And the buyer is like, I don't want to buy wheat at $7 after 2 months. I want to still buy the wheat at $5 after 2 months. So I need to lock in this price right now so that I can use the same price after 2 months. Seller here thinks that the price of the wheat might decrease because the season will be really good. There will be a lot of supply of wheat and then the price of wheat will decrease. Hence the seller is like, I don't want to take the risk that if the price of the wheat decreases, I don't want to sell my wheat at let's say $3. I want to still keep the same price of $5 and sell it at the same price after 2 months. So as you can see here, the buyer and the seller both have very different views of how the price of the wheat will go. The buyer is thinking that the price of the wheat will increase, hence he wants to protect himself from the increase, while the seller thinks that the price of the wheat will decrease and the seller wants to protect themselves from the decrease of price of the wheat. So that's why they enter into a futures contract. Now let's see how does a futures contract look like. So the futures contract will have basic information like contract size, which is let's say 1,000 or 100 bushels. Then it will have a price, which will be, let's consider $5 per bushels. And it will have a date when this futures will be expiring, which will, let's say, be 1st of August, right? So now what does the futures contract say? The contract says that at 1st August, the buyer has to buy 1,000 bushels of wheat at $5 per bushels and the seller has to sell the buyer 100 bushels at $5 per bushel. So basically it's a written promise and now no one can back out of this deal. Now, even if the price increases or decreases, the buyer and the seller have agreed to pay $5 and receive $5 per bushels for the quantity. Now that we have this futures contract, there are two scenarios what can happen. The price of the wheat can either go up or it can go down. Now let's see who profits from price going up and who profits from price going down. So there are two scenarios. The price can either go up to $7 or the price can either go down to $3 per bushel. Right? If the price goes up, then let's consider we have seller and we have the buyer. Now, what did the seller say? That I will sell you at $5 per bushel. But now today on 1st August, the price is actually $7. So the seller here will actually profit if the seller was not in the futures contract and he could have sold his wheat for $7. But now that he has given a promise, he cannot sell it for $7. He has to sell it for $5. That means he's taking a loss of $2 per bushel. So for seller, it's a loss. And similarly for buyer, it's a profit because the buyer, if today he had to go out and buy wheat, he had to pay $7. But instead of $7, because of the promise, he's getting it at $5. So it's a profit for buyer and a loss for seller. And what's the loss and the profit? Is basically the difference in the price, which is $2 multiplied by the quantity contract size, which is 100, which comes up to $200. Similarly, if the price goes down to $3, what will happen to the seller and the buyer? So here, instead of selling it at $3 now in the market, he has already made a promise to the buyer to sell it at $5. So the buyer has to buy it for $5. That means it's a profit for seller because now if the seller was not in this contract, he would have sold it for $3 instead of $5. So now it's a $2 profit. So basically it's the reverse of what happened when the price increased. So for seller now it's a profit, and for buyer, if buyer was not in this particular contract, he could have went in the market and sold it for $3. But now that he's in promise, he has given the promise, he has to buy it for $5. He can't buy it for $3. That means it's a loss. He's buying it at a higher price because of the promise. Now you would ask, like, why would anyone go into this futures contract? Like, why is this helpful, right? And let me explain you. So imagine this is the futures contract and this will have a price. The price of the futures contract will depend on a lot of things. For example, what is the income from wheat? What's the storage cost of wheat? What's the risk-free rate? A lot of items, right? What's the date at which the futures contract is expiring? And a lot of other factors based on which the price of the futures contract is decided. Let's say for simplicity, the price of the futures contract is again $5 per bushel, which means it's $500, which is 5 into 100, because that's the quantity we have here. Now, the farmer, let's say the buyer or the seller, they don't have to pay $500 in order to enter into a futures agreement. All they have to do is they have to pay something called initial margin. So there are two concepts here, right? The first concept is initial margin. So if the initial margin is 10%, the buyer and the seller only have to pay 10% of 500 to enter into this agreement. That is only $50. So just by paying $50, they get an exposure to $500 worth of contract. Now, in this case where the price is decreasing to $3, it's a profit for seller of $200. So basically, if price decreases, seller profits $200 by only spending $50. So here you see, just by spending the amount of money, which is let's say the initial margin, you get a big exposure to everything in the contract, right? That's why usually people go into trading derivatives like futures and options and swaps, because just by putting a small amount of money, you get a exposure to a lump sum amount of money, right? So this is how the mechanics of futures work. So let's also understand the different players involved in this, right? So we have the buyer and we also have the seller, but we have one more person, which is the clearing agent. The clearing agent sits in between buyer and the seller. So now what happens is, on an everyday basis, until we reach 1st August date, right? Until we reach this particular date, on an everyday basis, the clearing agent will calculate who is at profit and who is at loss. For example, let's say the next day we enter into an agreement on 1st of June and it's expiring on 1st August, right? So on 2nd June, the clearing agent will check what is the price of the wheat. Let's say it's dropped at $3. That means it's a profit for seller and a loss for buyer. So the amount that seller is profited, it will be transferred from buyer to seller if the price goes down. If the price goes up, that means buyer is profited. So seller has to pay buyer. And this happens on an everyday basis. So what this means is we have a clearinghouse settlement that happens on an everyday basis. So this ensures that the buyer and the seller, they don't have to really worry about, okay, if the other person will give me the money or not, because there is someone sitting in between to make sure or to ensure that the money is transferred and there is no counterparty risk. So in this case, the counterparty risk has reduced because it's clearinghouse agent who's taking care of it. That's futures. Now, why have I explained the whole story of clearinghouse agents and buyers and sellers and how it operates and why is it settled? The reason is it's a good segue to understanding how forwards operate, right? So forwards are very, very similar to futures. The only difference between forwards and futures is futures are exchange traded. So basically you can find them on New York Exchange and different exchanges, but forwards are actually OTC traded, right? They're over the counter. They are not listed on exchanges, which means that if forwards are not trade on exchanges, there is no clearinghouse agent who sits in between buyers and sellers, meaning there is no one to ensure that the payment is being done between a buyer and the seller, which means the counterparty risk has increased multiple folds, right? So the disadvantage here for forwards is basically you don't really have someone to make sure that the payment is done between buyer and seller. That means there's a big counterparty risk. But on the other hand, the advantage is you can actually modify the contract and the agreements, right? So basically you can say these are all bespoke agreements that happen between a buyer and the seller. For example, if something is listed on an exchange, you can't really negotiate the terms. But if something is not listed on an exchange, you can actually form and negotiate all the contractual terms and make sure both the parties are satisfied. And that's why people sometimes use forwards. So that's on a high level what forwards are and how is it different from futures. Let's take a few examples and try to understand how futures are really applicable in the real world. So if you look at the stock market right now, you can see a futures based on US crude oil. Now, why is it important? So let's say if you are a CEO of an airline company, so airlines use a lot of oil, like for gas, right? And eventually that impacts the airline prices. So if you want to control your airline prices, you really need to pay attention to what's the price of the oil. And if you think in the next 2 months, based on the geopolitical scenario, the prices of oil might shoot up, what you would do? You would go into a futures agreement today that locks in the oil price so that 2 months down the line, even if the oil shoots up by $50, you don't really care because you've already priced in or locked in the oil for a cheaper rate. That's how, let's say, an oil futures is important for an airline company. Let's take another example. Let's imagine you're a student and you're going to get a job after, let's say, a year, right? Now, you are in United States and your family is in India and you want to send some money to India. Right now, the rates INR versus USD is quite favorable. For example, 1 USD corresponds to 80 INR. But you feel after a year that 1 USD will be equal to 75 INR. Basically, USD will grow stronger. That's your assumption. So what you do is, right now you don't have the money to send to India. So you go into a futures contract and you lock in that rate of 80 INR. And you say that after 1 year, I will still send the money to India at a 80 INR exchange rate, irrespective of how the rate performs. So for example, after a year, if the rate drops to, let's say, 70 or 60 or 50 INR, you don't really care because you will still be able to send money at 80 INR. So what we discussed right now is basically a futures contract on a foreign exchange. So that's exactly how simple a futures contract is. In the next video, we'll cover options and swaps. But in the meantime, if you have suggestions, if you have questions, anything about the video, about the next upcoming videos, just drop me a comment and I'll take a look. Thank you for watching.